David Johnson had always dreamed of owning a boat. Growing up in Detroit, he spent summers visiting his grandfather who lived near Lake Huron. Those were the best days of his childhood, casting fishing lines at dawn, learning to tie knots, and listening to his grandfather's stories about the old days. His grandfather always said that a man needed a place to think, and for him, that place was on the water. Now, 32 years old and working as a software engineer for a tech company, David finally had enough saved up to make that dream come true. After months of searching, he found it. A beautiful 24-foot fishing boat that was perfect for weekend trips. The previous owner had taken excellent care of it. The white fiberglass hull gleamed in the sunlight, and the engine purged, like a contented cat. David had moved to Sunset Harbor Community just 6 months earlier. It was a big step up from his old apartment across town. The houses here were bigger, the lawns were perfectly maintained, and there was even a small marina where residents could dock their boats. When he first toured the neighborhood, the real estate agent had mentioned how exclusive it was. David noticed he was one of only a few black residents, but the area was beautiful, and the marina access made it worth every penny of his savings. The day he brought his boat home, David felt like he had finally made it. He spent hours cleaning every surface, organizing his fishing gear, and making sure everything was exactly where it should be. His neighbor, Mr. Peterson, an elderly white man who lived next door, came over to admire the boat. "That's a fine vessel." "You got there," Mr. Peterson said, running his hand along the side. "Been fishing these waters for 40 years myself. You picked a good spot to dock her." David smiled. It felt good to connect with someone in the neighborhood. Most of his other neighbors had been polite but distant. Mr. Peterson seemed genuinely friendly. "Thanks," David replied. "I'm planning to take her out this weekend. Any recommendations for good fishing spots?" Mr. Peterson's eyes lit up. For the next hour, he shared his knowledge of the local waters, where the best fish could be found, which areas to avoid during certain weather, and the unwritten rules of the local fishing community. David felt grateful to have found someone who shared his passion. Over the next few months, David established a routine. Friday evenings after work, he would head down to the marina to prepare his boat for weekend adventures. Saturday mornings found him on the water before sunrise, coffee in a thermos, watching the world wake up around him. Sometimes Mr. Peterson would join him, and they would spend hours talking about everything and nothing while waiting for the fish to bite. David loved those peaceful moments on the water. His job was demanding, requiring long hours staring at computer screens and solving complex problems. The boat was his escape from all of that stress. Out there, with just the sound of water lapping against the hull and seagulls calling overhead, he could finally relax. But not everything in the neighborhood was perfect. The Homeowners Association was run by a woman named Linda Whitmore, and she had very specific ideas about how things should be. David first encountered her during his second week in the neighborhood when she knocked on his door with a clipboard and a stern expression. "Mr. Johnson," she said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping into his entryway, "I wanted to welcome you to our community and review some of our guidelines." Linda was a tall, thin woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than David's monthly car payment. She handed him a thick folder filled with rules and regulations. "We pride ourselves on maintaining property values here," she continued. "I trust you'll make sure your lawn is kept to our standards, and that any modifications to your property are pre-approved by the board." David flipped through the folder. There were rules about everything: what color you could paint your house, how tall your grass could be, where you could park your car, even what kind of mailbox was acceptable. It felt excessive, but he figured every neighborhood had its quirks. "Of course," he replied. "I want to be a good neighbor." Linda's smile seemed forced. "I'm sure you do. Oh, and about that boat of yours. Make sure it's always properly secured. At the dock. We can't have any liability issues." After she left, David felt uneasy. There was something about the way she looked at him, the way she emphasized certain words that made him feel like he was being watched and judged. Mr. Peterson later confirmed his suspicions. "Linda's always been particular," the older man said, while they were fishing one Saturday morning. "But she's gotten worse since she became HOA president 3 years ago. Thinks she runs the whole neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Has she always lived here? David asked. About 10 years now. Her husband Tom is all right, but Linda, she's got strong opinions about how things should be, and who belongs where, if you catch my meaning. David caught his meaning perfectly. Over the following weeks, he noticed Linda's behavior more clearly. She would drive slowly past his house, checking his lawn and the position of his trash cans. When he hosted a small barbecue for some colleagues from work, she appeared the next day with complaints about noise levels, even though the gathering had ended before 9 p.m. The breaking point came during a community meeting about the annual fundraiser. David attended, thinking it would be a good way to get more involved. The meeting was held in the community center and about 30 residents showed up. Linda stood at the front, presenting plans for their biggest event of the year. This year's Sunset Cruise will be our most successful yet, she announced. We've already confirmed attendance from several major donors who are interested in supporting our beautification projects. She clicked through a presentation showing photos from previous years. Groups of well-dressed people on a large yacht, enjoying catered food and drinks while watching the sunset from the water. The challenge this year, Linda continued, is securing the right vessel. Our usual charter company has had some mechanical issues with their boat. David raised his hand. I have a boat that might work, depending on how many people you're expecting. The room went quiet. Linda's expression shifted, and David immediately regretted speaking up. Oh, she said, her voice carrying a tone he couldn't quite identify. That's very generous of you to offer, but I think we need something more suitable for our donor demographic. The dismissal stung. David's boat was beautiful and well-maintained. It could easily handle 20 people for a sunset cruise. But clearly, Linda had other ideas about what was suitable. As the meeting continued, David felt increasingly uncomfortable. When he suggested some ideas for community events that might appeal to different residents, Linda politely but firmly shut down each proposal. By the time he left, he understood that despite living in the neighborhood and paying his HOA fees just like everyone else, he wasn't really considered part of the community that mattered. 2 weeks later, David's phone rang with the call that would change everything. His mother's voice was shaky as she explained that his father had suffered a heart attack and was in the hospital back in Detroit. David needed to come home immediately. He threw clothes into a suitcase and made arrangements with his boss to work remotely for however long it took. Before leaving, he stopped by the marina to secure his boat for an extended absence. He double-checked all the lines, made sure everything was properly covered, and locked the cabin. His last stop was next door to let Mr. Peterson know he would be gone. Take care of your family, the older man said, shaking David's hand. Don't worry about things here. I'll keep an eye on your place. As David drove toward the airport, he had no idea that his absence would give Linda Whitmore the opportunity she had been waiting for. His beautiful boat, sitting unattended at the marina, was about to become the center of a scandal that would rock the entire neighborhood. 3 days after David left for Detroit, Linda Whitmore stood at her kitchen window with her morning coffee, staring out at the marina. The annual fundraiser was only 5 days away, and she still didn't have a boat. The charter company had called yesterday with more bad news. Their repairs would take at least 2 weeks. Linda prided herself on never accepting failure. As HOA president, she had built a reputation for making things happen, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. This fundraiser was crucial. The community's wealthiest residents would be attending, including the Hendersons, who had hinted at a $50,000 donation for the new garden project. Her gaze settled on David's boat, bobbing gently at its mooring. It had been sitting there unused since he left town. Linda knew about his family emergency from the neighborhood gossip chain. Mr. Peterson had mentioned it to several people at the mailboxes. Such a waste, she muttered to herself. A perfectly good boat just sitting there when the community needs it. Linda had always felt there was something not quite right about David living in their exclusive neighborhood. When he first moved in, she had done her research. His job was legitimate enough, but he didn't quite fit the profile of their typical resident. And that boat of his? Well, she had to admit it was nice. Maybe too nice for someone like him. The more she thought about it, the more reasonable her idea seemed. David wasn't even in town. He would never know if she borrowed his boat for one evening. It would actually be doing him a favor, keeping the engine running, making sure everything stayed in good working order. By the time she finished her coffee, Linda had convinced herself that using David's boat was practically a community service. She called Janet Mills, the HOA treasurer and her closest ally on the board. Janet was always eager to please Linda and rarely questioned her decisions. "Janet, I have a solution for our boat problem," Linda said when Janet answered the phone. "Oh, thank goodness," Janet replied. "I was starting to panic. The Hendersons specifically asked about the Sunset Cruise when they RSVP'd. You know that boat belonging to the Johnson man? The one who lives on Maple Street?" There was a pause. "You mean David? The one with the family emergency?" "Exactly. His boat is just sitting there unused. It would be perfect for our event." Another pause, longer this time. "Linda, are you suggesting we ask to borrow it? I'm not sure he's even reachable right now. I heard his father is in intensive care." Linda had anticipated this hesitation. "Janet, we don't have time to track him down and deal with paperwork and insurance questions. This is an emergency situation. We're borrowing it for a few hours to benefit the entire community. I'm sure he would understand if he knew how important this fundraiser is." "But Linda, we can't just take someone's boat without permission. That's theft." "Don't be dramatic, Janet. We're not stealing anything. We're borrowing a community asset for a community event. Besides, who's going to know? He's 1,000 miles away dealing with family issues." Linda could hear Janet's internal struggle through the phone. She knew her friend wanted to object, but Janet had never been strong enough to stand up to her when Linda was determined about something. "I suppose if it's just for a few hours," Janet said slowly, "and if we're very careful with it." "Of course we'll be careful. I've been boating for 20 years. Now, do you still have that spare key you saw him use?" Janet had mentioned weeks earlier that she'd noticed David hide a key near his boat. She lived close to the marina and often walked her dog along the docks in the evening. "Yes, I think so. He keeps it in a magnetic box under the back rail. But Linda, I really think we should try to contact him first." "Janet, we don't have time for that. The fundraiser is in 5 days. Do you want to explain to the Hendersons and the other major donors why we had to cancel? Do you want to tell them that our HOA can't even organize a simple boat ride?" The threat was clear. Linda knew that Janet feared disappointing the neighborhood's wealthy residents almost as much as she feared disappointing Linda herself. "All right," Janet said finally, "but we need to be extremely careful, and we put it back exactly where we found it. Obviously. Now, I need you to meet me at the marina tonight after dark. We'll take the boat out for a quick test run to make sure everything works properly." That evening, Linda and Janet walked nervously down the dock toward David's boat. The marina was quiet except for the gentle sounds of water and rigging. Most boat owners were home having dinner with their families. "I have a bad feeling about this," Janet whispered as they approached the boat. "Relax," Linda replied, though her own heart was beating faster than usual. "We're not doing anything wrong. This is community property as far as I'm concerned." Janet found the magnetic key box exactly where she remembered it. Her hands shook slightly as she handed the key to Linda. "You do the honors," Linda said. "Since you found the key." "No, this was your idea. You do it." Linda took the key and unlocked the cabin. The boat was immaculate inside. David had clearly taken excellent care of it. She felt a momentary pang of guilt but pushed it aside. This was for the good of the community. "See," she said to Janet. "Everything's perfect. He'll never even know we were here." Linda had been boating since college, and David's boat was similar to others she had operated. She started the engine, which turned over smoothly, and they took a short trip around the harbor to test the handling. "It runs beautifully," Linda said as they returned to the dock. "This will be perfect for the fundraiser." Over the next 2 days, Linda threw herself into planning every detail of the Sunset Cruise. She arranged for catering from the most expensive restaurant in town, ordered premium wine and champagne, and even hired a pianist to provide background music. This would be an event that the donors would never forget. She also took care of practical matters. On Thursday evening, she and Janet returned to David's boat to do a thorough cleaning and preparation. Linda brought her own tablecloths, dishes, and decorations to transform the boat into an elegant floating venue. "This is actually turning out better than if we had used the charter boat," Linda told Janet as they arranged flowers in vases around the deck. "This feels more personal, more exclusive." Janet still seemed nervous. What if someone recognizes the boat? What if David has friends in the neighborhood who know it's his? "Janet, you worry too much. David's been here less than a year. He barely knows anyone besides that old man Peterson. And Peterson's not even invited to the fundraiser." Linda had been very careful about the guest list. Only the wealthiest and most influential residents received invitations. It was meant to be an intimate gathering of the community's elite, not a neighborhood-wide event. As Friday evening approached, Linda felt a surge of excitement. Everything was falling into place perfectly. The weather forecast was ideal, the catering was confirmed, and the boat looked magnificent. She had even arranged for professional photos to document the event for the community newsletter. "This is going to be the most successful fundraiser in our neighborhood's history," she told her husband Tom, as she got dressed in her nautical-themed outfit, white pants, navy blazer, and boat shoes that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Tom had asked a few questions about whose boat they were using, but Linda had been vague in her answers. She told him it belonged to a community member who was happy to help with the cause. It wasn't exactly a lie, she reasoned. David was a community member, and surely he would be happy to help if he knew how important this was. The first guests began arriving at the marina at 6 p.m. Linda greeted each couple personally, guiding them aboard David's boat as if she owned it herself. The compliments began immediately. "What a beautiful vessel," said Mrs. Henderson, the evening's most important guest. "Where did you find such a lovely boat for our event?" "It belongs to one of our residents," Linda replied smoothly. "Someone who really believes in giving back to the community." As more guests arrived and the champagne began flowing, Linda felt completely vindicated in her decision. This was exactly what the boat was meant for, bringing together the neighborhood's most important people for a worthy cause. David should feel honored that his boat was being used for such a distinguished gathering. She had no idea that her perfect evening was about to take a very dramatic turn. As the boat pulled away from the dock with 15 of the community's wealthiest residents aboard, Linda felt like she was finally getting the recognition she deserved as a leader. But 20 miles away, the Coast Guard was already preparing to investigate reports of suspicious activity at the marina. And back in Detroit, David Johnson was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. The evening was absolutely perfect. Linda stood at the helm of David's boat, feeling the warm breeze in her hair as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Behind her, 15 of the neighborhood's wealthiest residents mingled on the deck, sipping champagne and enjoying the catered appetizers. "Linda, this is simply magnificent," called out Mrs. Henderson, raising her glass of Dom Perignon. "You've outdone yourself this year." Linda beamed with pride. Everything was going exactly as planned. The pianist was playing soft jazz. The photographer was capturing beautiful shots of the donors against the sunset backdrop, and the pledge envelopes were already filling up with generous donations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda announced, tapping her champagne flute to get everyone's attention. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." The conversations quieted as the guests turned toward her. Linda felt a rush of power standing there at the helm, commanding the attention of the community's elite while piloting what she now thought of as her boat. "I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for what I believe will be our most successful fundraiser yet," she began. "Your generosity continues to make our community the most desirable place to live in the entire county." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mr. Henderson, a retired bank president, nodded approvingly. "The funds we raise tonight will go toward our new community garden project, additional security measures, and continued beautification efforts," Linda continued. "Together, we're not just maintaining property values, we're creating a legacy." The applause was enthusiastic. Linda felt vindicated in every decision she had made to get to this moment. Taking David's boat hadn't just been justified, it had been inspired. As the boat continued its leisurely cruise along the coastline, Linda regaled her guests with stories of her boating experience. She told them about sailing lessons in college, yacht club memberships, and family vacations on the water. What she didn't mention was that most of her actual boating experience had been as a passenger, not a captain. "This vessel handles beautifully," she said, patting the steering wheel affectionately. "I've been looking at boats like this for years. The owner has exquisite taste." Janet Mills, standing nearby with a glass of wine, shifted uncomfortably. She had been trying to enjoy the evening, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. Every compliment about the boat made her more nervous. "Linda," Janet whispered when she got a chance to speak privately, "maybe we should head back. Soon. We've been out for almost an hour." "Nonsense," Linda replied. "We paid for a sunset cruise and we're going to get our full sunset. Look at that sky." The sky was indeed spectacular. The sun was painting the clouds in brilliant shades of orange and pink, creating the perfect backdrop for their elegant gathering. The photographer was having a field day, and several guests were taking selfies to post on social media. Linda decided to extend their route, taking the boat further from shore to get better views of the sunset. She felt completely in control, completely confident. This was her moment to shine as a leader. But 15 minutes later, everything changed. "What's that light behind us?" asked Mr. Peterson, squinting toward the horizon. Linda turned to look and felt her stomach drop. A white boat with flashing blue and red lights was approaching rapidly from the direction of the harbor. Even from a distance, she could see the distinctive markings of the Coast Guard. "Probably just a routine patrol," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nothing to worry about." But the Coast Guard vessel was clearly heading directly toward them, and it was moving fast. The guests on deck had noticed too, and conversations were beginning to quiet as people watched the approaching boat. Linda's mind raced. Why would the Coast Guard be interested in them? They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just having a peaceful sunset cruise. Her hands began to sweat as she gripped the steering wheel. "This is the United States Coast Guard," came a voice over a loudspeaker. "Prepare to be boarded for inspection." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. Several guests gasped and Janet's face went completely white. This was definitely not routine. "What's happening?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice sharp with concern. "Linda, what's going on?" "I'm sure it's just a standard safety check," Linda replied, but her voice was shaking now. "These things happen all the time." That wasn't true, and everyone on the boat knew it. Coast Guard boardings were serious business, not casual encounters. Linda reluctantly brought the boat to a stop as the Coast Guard vessel pulled alongside. Two uniformed officers prepared to board, their expressions professional but stern. "Good evening," said the lead officer, a woman with lieutenant stripes on her uniform. "I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez with the Coast Guard. We need to see the boats, registration, and proof of ownership." The words Linda had been dreading. She felt dizzy as the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She had no registration papers because this wasn't her boat. She had no proof of ownership because she wasn't the owner. "Of course," Linda said, stalling for time. "Let me just get those documents from the cabin." She made her way below deck, on unsteady legs, her mind frantically searching for a way out of this disaster. Behind her, she could hear the nervous chatter of her guests and Janet's whispered prayers. In the cabin, Linda rifled through every compartment, hoping against hope that David had left some paperwork she could use. But there was nothing except fishing gear and personal items that clearly belonged to someone else. When she returned to the deck empty-handed, Lieutenant Rodriguez was waiting with a clipboard and a very serious expression. "I'm having trouble locating the paperwork," Linda said weakly. "Ma'am, are you the owner of this vessel?" Lieutenant Rodriguez asked directly. Linda's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. "Well, you see, it's complicated. Ma'am, I need a simple yes or no answer. Are you the registered owner of this boat?" The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Every guest was staring at Linda, waiting for her response. Janet looked like she might faint. "No," Linda finally whispered. "Then who is the owner, and do you have their permission to operate this vessel?" Linda felt trapped. She could see the confusion and growing alarm on her guests' faces. These were important people, bank presidents, business owners, community leaders. They had trusted her to organize a legitimate event, and now they were caught up in what was clearly becoming a legal situation. "The owner he's a member of our community," Linda said, her voice getting smaller with each word. "David Johnson. But he's out of town, and there was a family emergency, and we needed a boat for our fundraiser. Ma'am, do you have written permission from Mr. Johnson to use his boat?" "No, but he would have said yes if we had been able to reach him. This is for charity. It's for the community." Lieutenant Rodriguez exchanged glances with her partner. This was clearly not going the way Linda had imagined when she hatched her plan. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that operating someone else's vessel without their explicit permission is a serious matter. We're going to need to contact Mr. Johnson directly to verify your claims. He's dealing with a family emergency," Linda protested. "His father is in the hospital. We can't bother him with this right now." "Ma'am, that's exactly what we're going to do." As Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped away to make radio contact with her headquarters, Linda faced the horrified stares of 15 very wealthy, very influential community members who were beginning to realize they had been unwittingly involved in what appeared to be boat theft. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the evening air like a knife. "Linda Whitmore, please tell me you didn't steal this boat for our fundraiser." Linda opened her mouth to protest, to explain, to somehow make this all make sense, but no words came out. She could only stand there watching her reputation, her leadership position, and her standing in the community crumble around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. The Coast Guard radio crackled to life in the background, and Linda knew that in a few minutes David Johnson would be receiving a very surprising phone call in a Detroit hospital. Her perfect evening had become a nightmare, and there was no way to wake up from it. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped away from the group, speaking quietly into her radio. The guests on David's boat stood in stunned silence, their elegant evening completely derailed by the revelation that they were aboard a stolen vessel. "Coast Guard Station, this is Lieutenant Rodriguez on Patrol Boat 734, she said into her radio. "I need you to contact a David Johnson regarding possible unauthorized use of his vessel. Registration number." She read off the numbers from the boat's registration sticker. Meanwhile, Linda stood frozen at the helm, watching her carefully constructed world fall apart. Janet Mills had moved as far away from her as possible on the small deck, clearly trying to distance herself from the situation. "Linda," Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that could freeze water, "please explain to me exactly what is happening here." Before Linda could answer, her husband Tom spoke up from where he had been quietly nursing a glass of wine. "Linda, whose boat is this really?" All eyes turned back to Linda. She felt like a deer caught in headlights, surrounded by some of the most powerful people in their community, all waiting for an explanation that would somehow make sense of this disaster. "It belongs to David Johnson," she said quietly. "He lives on Maple Street. He's been gone for almost a week because of a family emergency." "And did you ask his permission to use his boat?" asked Mr. Henderson, his banker's instincts forgetting to the truth immediately apparent. Linda's silence was answer enough. "You stole this man's boat," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice rising. "You invited us onto a stolen boat for a charity fundraiser. Do you have any idea what kind of position you've put us in?" The implications were hitting everyone at once. These were prominent business people, community leaders, people who couldn't afford to be associated with anything questionable, let alone criminal activity. "I didn't steal it," Linda protested weakly. "I borrowed it. For charity. For the community. David would have understood if we could have reached him." "That's not how the law works," said Mr. Peterson, who despite his age had a sharp legal mind from his years as a corporate attorney. "Taking someone's property without permission is theft, regardless of your intentions." Lieutenant Rodriguez returned to the group, her expression grave. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just spoken with Mr. Johnson. He's currently at Detroit General Hospital with his father, who suffered a massive heart attack. Mr. Johnson confirmed that he did not give anyone permission to use his boat. A collective gasp went up from the guests. Linda felt the deck spinning beneath her feet. Furthermore, Lieutenant Rodriguez continued, Mr. Johnson was quite shocked to learn that his boat was not only being used without permission, but was currently hosting a party on the water. What did he say? Janet asked in a voice barely above a whisper. He said, and I quote, "Are you telling me that someone stole my boat while I'm sitting in a hospital watching my father fight for his life?" The weight of those words hit everyone like a physical blow. Even Linda, in her desperation to justify her actions, couldn't argue with the stark reality of what she had done. "We need to head back to shore immediately," Lieutenant Rodriguez announced. "This vessel is evidence in a potential criminal investigation." As T. Hay began the trip back to the marina, the mood on the boat was funeral quiet. The catered food sat untouched, the champagne had gone flat, and the photographer had stopped taking pictures. What was supposed to be the social event of the season had become a humiliating disaster. Mrs. Henderson moved to stand next to Linda at the helm. "I want you to understand something," she said in a low voice. "My husband and I have donated over $200,000 to various community causes over the past 5 years. We did that because we believed in responsible leadership. This ends all of that." One by one, other major donors approached Linda with similar messages. The financial impact was becoming clear. Not only would tonight's fundraiser be a complete failure, but the long-term damage to the HOA's reputation would cost them hundreds of thousands in future donations. When they reached the marina, local police were waiting on the dock. Lieutenant Rodriguez had radioed ahead to request assistance with what was now officially being treated as a theft investigation. "Ma'am," said Detective Williams, a middle-aged black officer who approached Linda as she stepped off the boat. "I need you to come with me to answer some questions." "This is all a misunderstanding," Linda said, but her voice carried no conviction anymore. "Ma'am, we'll sort that out at the station. Right now, I need you to understand that you're being detained for questioning regarding the unauthorized use of a motor vehicle." As Detective Williams placed Linda in the back of his patrol car, the guests from the fundraiser stood on the dock in shocked silence. Janet Mills was crying openly, and several people were already on their phones, presumably calling lawyers or trying to figure out how to distance themselves from the evening's events. Tom Whitmore stood apart from the group, staring at his wife through the window of the police car. In all their years of marriage, he had never seen Linda make such a spectacularly poor decision. Back at the police station, Linda found herself in an interrogation room that smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. Detective Williams sat across from her with a tape recorder and a notepad. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to walk me through exactly how you came to be operating Mr. Johnson's boat this evening." Linda tried one more time to frame her actions in the best possible light. She talked about the emergency with the charter boat, the importance of the fundraiser, the community benefit, David's absence. But with each word, she could see that her explanation sounded weaker and more pathetic. "So let me make sure I understand," Detective Williams said when she finished. "You took Mr. Johnson's boat without asking because you thought it would be okay?" "It wasn't like that," Linda protested. "I was going to explain everything to him when he got back. I was going to make sure the boat was returned in perfect condition." "But you didn't ask permission first?" "There wasn't time. The fundraiser was—" "Mrs. Whitmore, there's always time to ask permission before taking someone else's property. That's pretty basic." While Linda was being questioned, the story was already spreading through the community like wildfire. Social media posts from the guests who had been on the boat were generating hundreds of comments. The local news had picked up the story after monitoring police radio traffic. By 10 p.m., HOA president arrested for boat theft was trending on the local Facebook groups, and the story was being shared across multiple platforms. Meanwhile, in Detroit, David Johnson sat in his father's hospital room, trying to process what the Coast Guard had told him. His father was stable now, breathing steadily with the help of machines, but David's mind kept returning to the phone call. Someone had stolen his boat. Not just anyone. the president of his HOA, the woman who had looked down on him from the day he moved to the neighborhood. She had taken his boat, filled it with her friends, and used it for a private party while he sat by his father's bedside. The anger was overwhelming. David had worked so hard to buy that boat, had saved every penny, had treated it like his most precious possession. And now he discovered that while he was dealing with the worst crisis of his family's life, someone who barely acknowledged his existence had decided his property was theirs to use. His phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Peterson. "David, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what Linda was planning. The whole neighborhood is in shock. Please know that not everyone here feels the way she does." As David read the message, he realized that this incident had revealed something important about the community he had tried so hard to join. Some people, like Mr. Peterson, genuinely welcomed him, but others, like Linda, had never seen him as anything more than an outsider whose belongings were available for their convenience. The question now was what he would do about it. The Coast Guard and police were treating this as a serious crime, but David had to decide how far he wanted to pursue the matter. His boat was safe, returned to its slip without damage, but the violation of trust, the casual assumption that his property was available for taking, that was something that couldn't be undone. As he sat in the hospital room, listening to his father's steady breathing, David made a decision that would change everything for Linda Whitmore and the entire Sunset Harbor community. David returned to Sunset Harbor 3 days later to find his neighborhood completely transformed. The story of Linda's arrest had exploded across social media and local news. TV vans were parked along the street, and reporters were interviewing anyone willing to talk about the scandal. His first stop was the marina to check on his boat. As he walked down the dock, he was relieved to see it exactly where he had left it, apparently undamaged. But the sight of it brought back a fresh wave of anger. This vessel represented years of hard work and sacrifice, and someone had treated it like community property. Mr. Peterson was waiting for him at the dock, looking older and more tired than David had ever seen him. "David, I'm so sorry about all this," the elderly man said, shaking his head. "I had no idea what Linda was planning. If I had known, I would have stopped her myself." "It's not your fault," David replied, running his hand along the side of his boat. "But I need to understand something. How did this happen? How did she think she could just take my boat?" Mr. Peterson sighed deeply. "Linda's always been entitled, but this was different. I think she saw you as someone who didn't really belong here, so your property didn't really matter to her." The words stung because David suspected they were true. In Linda's mind, he wasn't a real member of the community deserving of basic respect and consideration. "The whole neighborhood's talking about it," Mr. Peterson continued. "Most people are horrified by what she did. There's a petition going around demanding her resignation from the HOA." That afternoon, David met with Detective Williams to discuss the charges. The detective explained that Linda was facing several serious charges, including unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, trespassing, and conspiracy. "What she did was clearly criminal," Detective Williams said, "but we need to know how you want to proceed. Are you willing to press charges?" David had been wrestling with this question since the night of the incident. Part of him wanted to see Linda face the full consequences of her actions. But another part of him wondered if there was a better way to handle the situation. "Can I have some time to think about it?" he asked. "Of course. But I should warn you, this story has gotten a lot of media attention. The racial dynamics of a white HOA president taking a black resident's property haven't gone unnoticed. There's going to be pressure from all sides." David hadn't fully considered the racial implications until the detective mentioned them. But as he drove through his neighborhood that evening, he saw protesters with signs reading "Justice for David" and "End HOA Racism." The incident had become about much more than just a stolen boat. The next morning, David's doorbell rang early. He opened it to find Janet Mills standing on his porch, looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Janet Mills from the HOA board," she said nervously. "I was wondering if we could talk." David invited her in, curious to hear what she had to say. "I need you to know that I was involved in what happened with your boat. Janet began, her voice shaking. Linda convinced me to help her, and I was wrong to go along with it. I came here to apologize and to take responsibility for my part in this. David appreciated her honesty, but he could see that Janet was trying to minimize her role. You helped her steal my boat, he said bluntly. Yes, Janet said quietly. I did, and I'm deeply ashamed of that. I also want you to know that the HOA board held an emergency meeting yesterday. We voted unanimously to remove Linda as president. We're also prepared to cover any legal expenses you incur and to make whatever other restitution you think is appropriate. David studied Janet's face. She seemed genuinely remorseful, but he wondered if the board was more concerned about limiting their liability than making things right. What about systemic changes? David asked. How do I know this kind of thing won't happen again to someone else? We're implementing new policies, Janet replied quickly. Better oversight, term limits for board members, and a community code of conduct that explicitly prohibits this kind of behavior. It sounded good, but David wasn't entirely convinced. Changes in policy didn't necessarily mean changes in attitude. 2 days later, Linda's lawyer contacted David directly. Linda was hoping to avoid criminal charges and was willing to make a public apology and pay substantial damages. My client deeply regrets her actions, the lawyer said over the phone. She's prepared to make this right financially and to take full responsibility publicly. David was skeptical. Is she sorry she did it or sorry she got caught? There was a pause. I think she's genuinely sorry for the pain she's caused you and your family. That evening, David sat in his living room trying to decide what to do. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and community activists who wanted him to pursue the maximum penalties against Linda. But David wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in justice and in making sure that what happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. He called Detective Williams the next morning with his decision. I want to press charges, David said, but I'm also willing to consider a plea agreement if Linda agrees to certain conditions. What kind of conditions? First, a public apology that acknowledges the racial dynamics of what she did. Second, community service specifically focused on diversity and inclusion education. Third, permanent removal from any HOA leadership position. And fourth, she pays for diversity training for the entire HOA board. Detective Williams was impressed. That's a thoughtful approach. Let me run it by the prosecutor. The plea agreement was finalized 2 weeks later. Linda pled guilty to unauthorized use of a motor vehicle and was sentenced to 200 hours of community service, a substantial fine, and 2 years of probation. She also agreed to David's conditions. The public apology took place at a community meeting attended by over 200 residents and covered by local media. Linda stood at the podium, visibly uncomfortable, and read a statement acknowledging that her actions were motivated by unconscious bias and entitlement. I took Mr. Johnson's boat because I didn't see him as a full member of our community, she said, her voice barely audible. That was wrong, and it reflected prejudices that I need to confront and change. The statement was painful to watch, but David felt it was important for the community to hear Linda acknowledge the real reasons behind her actions. The incident had lasting effects on Sunset Harbor. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased as word spread about the community's commitment to addressing the issues that led to the scandal. The HOA implemented the promised reforms and elected its first black board member in the community's history. David decided to stay in the neighborhood, though he seriously considered moving. His boat remained his sanctuary, but now it also served as a symbol of his determination to stand up for himself and others who might face similar treatment. 6 months later, the neighborhood held its first annual Community Unity Day, featuring activities designed to bring together residents from all backgrounds. The event was held at the marina, and David's boat served as the flagship vessel for tours of the harbor, this time with his full permission and participation. Linda and her husband moved away 3 months after the incident. Tom had been laid off from his job when his employer decided they couldn't afford the negative publicity associated with the scandal. Linda's name had become synonymous with HOA overreach and racial insensitivity in local circles. The last David heard, Linda was working for a property management company in another state, far from the water and the community she had tried to control. She had completed her community service at a local civil rights organization, though staff there reported that she seemed to go through the motions without genuine engagement. For David, the incident was a painful but ultimately transformative experience. It forced him to confront the reality that acceptance in some communities comes with conditions, and that some people would always see him as an outsider. But it also showed him that there were good people willing to stand up for what was right. When faced with injustice, his boat, once just a means of escape and relaxation, had become something more. It was proof that he belonged in the community he had chosen, that his property and his rights deserved the same respect as anyone else's, and that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who might face similar treatment as a... David took his boat out for weekend fishing trips, often joined by Mr. Peterson and other neighbors who had become genuine friends. He reflected on how much had changed. The water was still peaceful, the fish still bit on lazy Saturday mornings, and the sunrise still painted the sky in brilliant colors. But now he enjoyed it all with the knowledge that he had fought for his place in this community, and won, not just for himself but for everyone who would come after him.